Hello, I'm Ian Stewart, and welcome to another episode of Wide Net of Esoterica. Well, it's day 3 of the series, and questions are starting to trickle in. We got a question: what exactly is historic preservation, and how did it get its start? Now, it's a good question. Here in the United States, historic preservation is the act of preserving historic buildings, graveyards, landscapes. For much of Europe, it's referred to as architectural conservation. But the two fields are synonymous. In the States, we have various laws. Some restrict, some are not. There's the National Register of Historic Places that everyone's heard about, which is mostly honorific. We'll go into that later, because I think today I'd rather deal with how preservation gets its start, because it happens here later than it happens in Europe. So we'll go to Europe. Now, really it gets going in France during the second quarter of the 19th century. There's a man named Eugène Viollet-le-Duc who's hired by the French government to go and restore medieval French things that had been destroyed or damaged during the Revolution. And LaDuke takes some liberties. He's sort of very much of the mindset of if they'd had it at the time, they would have used it, which creates some falsehoods. The central spire, the Flèche, at Notre Dame in Paris is a great example. That's a cast iron. That was a cast iron spire that was added by LaDuke that was taller than the original, and heavier. It's probably the reason why it came in like a flaming arrow. So LaDuke does Notre Dame, the city of Carcassonne. LaDuke handles somewhere between 800 and 1,000 French monuments. Now, at the same time in France, there's another fellow named Auguste Napoleon Didron, A.N. Didron, who is an architect. And he comes up with a maxim that, for me, is sort of the heart of preservation. And it's sort of, when I'm looking at a preservation project, I sort of keep these steps in mind. And Didron says it is better to preserve than to repair, better to repair than to restore, better to restore than to reconstruct. So there's the hierarchy. Preserve it, repair it, restore it, reconstruct it. So looking at various preservation projects in the United States, you've got Statue of Liberty. They've basically been preserving it, and then you've got Colonial Williamsburg, which is basically a recreation. A pretty well thought out recreation, but it's a recreation. So you've got LaDuke, you've got Didron, and then sort of LaDuke has a counterpart in England named Scot, who's sort of doing the same thing to English cathedrals. And along comes a fellow by the name of John Ruskin, famous author, philosopher, writes a book entitled The Seven Lamps of Architecture. Now, Ruskin belongs to a movement that's sort of known these days as the cult of the ruin. It becomes very popular in England and in Europe. When you sort of reach a stage in life, you go on a year-long tour of Europe, spend time in Italy, really exploring the ruins and seeing what has come before us. Now Ruskin firmly believes that those buildings, I mean, they're owned by the people who built them, and they are owned by our children. We don't have any right to touch those buildings. It's Ruskin. Ruskin has a follower named William Morris. Morris is one of the founders of the arts and crafts movement. Now, Morris and Ruskin together form the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, which still exists today, but it also sort of morphed into the National Trust in England. Now, Morris, lock, stock, and barrel, buys into Ruskin's philosophy, not necessarily for the same reasons that Ruskin does it. Morris is a pretty avowed Marxist, and his concept is, in 19th century industrialized England, the community spirit that had come together to create a medieval cathedral didn't exist anymore. There was no community anymore. It was sort of these industrial cogs and wheels in the machine. So, you sort of see Morris pushing back against industrialization, switching back to a craft tradition. In the same and at the same time, this sort of comes into Ruskin's philosophy. So you end up with two schools of thought: scrape and anti-scrape. Now, scrape is LaDuke, scrape is Scot. Let's take off all the layers of history. Remove, the building was built in 1300, and then in 1600 it was added to, and 1700 it was added to, and then things have happened, and part of it fell in 1900. Well, LaDuke or Scot would say bring it back to 1300. Ruskin and Morris, on the other hand, don't touch that. Those buildings, they're not ours to mess with. Ruskin firmly believes that they belong to our children and the people who built them. Morris believes we don't actually have the skill set to work on them, but the end result is the same. Morris and Ruskin, they don't want you to scrape off any of the history. Leave it as it is. If it's a ruin, leave it as a ruin. So those are the two schools of thought, scrape and anti-scrape. And out of the conversations between those two schools of thought, you start to see the development of the preservation movement. It would take really another 60 or 70 years for the preservation movement to really settle into the United States. We don't see serious preservation in the United States writ large until the 1960s and the signing of the National Historic Preservation Act. The first house museum in the United States is Mount Vernon, which is organized right before the Civil War by a group of women. And then the first two neighborhoods really that get established as historic neighborhoods. You've got Charleston, and then later on in the 50s, as a response to the tearing down of the West End, you get the historic neighborhood designation of Beacon Hill in Boston. So, and really, it's preservation in the United States is a pushback against urban renewal and the seizure and destruction of cities through terminology urban blight. But it all gets its start really is a sort of philosophical argument between the followers of LaDuke and Scot and the followers of Ruskin and Morris. So if you want to understand preservation, sort of look into those. I mean, LaDuke creates an encyclopedia, and he does amazing drawings of these buildings, and he creates a rich visual record. But his buildings are somewhat fanciful. And he definitely, I mean, if you were, personally, I follow the maxim of Diderot as much as I can. So again, it's better to preserve than to repair, better to repair than to restore, better to restore than to reconstruct. So that's that's the preservation philosophy I follow. So there it is, Ruskin, Morris, LaDuke, Scot, Diderot. Um, that's your 19th century preservation movement founding, really. So hopefully that answers the question about what preservation is and how it got its start. Again, if you email me at widenetofesoterica@gmail.com, or if you there's a link in the description to this video that takes you to a Google form that you can fill out and send me questions. So yeah, it should be right down there in the description here on YouTube. So thanks, and see you next time. I'm Ian Stewart. This is Wide Net of Esoterica.